Welcome to a new episode of Cheaters Always Cheat. Like, subscribe, and share to stay connected.
Remember that moment in The Godfather when Michael Corleone is entranced by a beautiful woman in Italy? His Sicilian bodyguards observe this and comment that he's been hit by the thunderbolt, a metaphor for falling head over heels in love. This isn't just a plot device in a movie, I've seen it happen in real life, although I didn't comprehend it at the time. It happened to my wife, but not when she first met me. It was with another man, a quarter century into our marriage, and it signaled the start of the dissolution of our seemingly idyllic life. But let me backtrack. I'm Alan Gregerson, or Greg as most people know me. I'm a 50-year-old accountant living in a small city in the Midwest, a 2-hour drive from Chicago. I work for a fairly large national company. The job can be monotonous, but it pays well, and except for the busy months of March and April, I usually stick to a 40-hour work week without weekends. I was married until 2 years ago, and my ex-wife and I have a daughter named Morgan, who's now 25, married, has a child, and resides in Denver. My marriage concluded with a divorce after 26 years. The initial 25 years of our union, which I've mentioned before, appeared blissful. I encountered Tracy during my sophomore year at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. She was also in her second year but had transferred to my dormitory after spending her first year in a different one. I spotted her athletic figure as she lay on a towel outside the dormitory, basking in the strong August sun of Iowa. I was entering the dormitory with a couple of friends when I noticed her out of the corner of my eye. "Excuse me, guys, I need to go introduce myself to the future Mrs. Gregerson," I declared in jest. Both of my friends followed my gaze towards Tracy. "Wow," one of them exclaimed. I heard the exclamation, but I couldn't identify which friend had uttered it. I was utterly entranced by this blonde beauty reclining on a towel in a bikini by the side of the dormitory. I left my friends and approached her, but when I was about 4 feet away, she propped herself up on one elbow and gestured for me to keep my distance with her other hand. I felt a sense of deflation until she spoke. "Hey, dummy, you're blocking my sun." I quickly moved about a foot to the right, allowing the sun to shine back on her. She rewarded me with a dazzling smile, and at that moment, I would have done anything she asked. "Much better, dummy," she chuckled. She didn't seem perturbed by a stranger approaching her. I suppose when you're as attractive as she was, it's probably a frequent occurrence. I introduced myself, praised her attractiveness, and summoned the bravery to ask her out for a date the following Friday. "If I agree, will you wipe that drool off your chin?" she playfully retorted. "What?" "Oh yes, the drool." "Absolutely, it's gone now," I stuttered, clearly smitten. "Well, I can tell you're not one of those suave guys with a witty remark for every occasion, so sure, we can go out on Friday night." I secured her phone number, and we dined at a quaint Italian restaurant in Ames that Friday evening. As I sat there, utterly enchanted, she divulged every detail of her life from the age of 3 to the present. I believe she only ceased speaking because our main course had arrived. We seemed to connect seamlessly, and within a month, we were spending nearly all our spare time together. She was not only intelligent, having been her high school's valedictorian, but she also possessed a playful sense of humor and a quiet confidence. I considered myself a fairly good-looking guy, not a superstar, but I was somewhat athletic, had earned 7 varsity letters in high school, was intelligent, ranked in the top 5 of my high school class, and could engage in a meaningful conversation on a broad range of subjects. While I wasn't one of those smooth-talking guys with a clever line for everything, I did possess a reasonable amount of self-confidence. However, when I asked Tracy out, I knew I was punching above my weight, but hey, you don't get anything if you don't take a risk, right? Tracy and I had our first intimate experience on our 6th date. Neither of us were novices, but I hadn't been with more than a few partners up to that point, and I sensed that Tracy was in a similar situation. Update: Tracy and I got married shortly after we graduated. Finding jobs was straightforward for both of us. She became a 3rd-grade teacher, and I secured a position as an accountant. Our incomes were steady. We bought a house a couple of years later, and almost a year after moving in, we welcomed our only child, a daughter named Morgan. Life was good. Our intimate life, though not wildly adventurous, provided us both with ample satisfaction. Like many couples, the frequency of our activities did slow down a bit with time and age. However, even when Morgan left for college, we were still quite active, 3 or 4 times a week. Over the years, I occasionally had moments of concern about Tracy's fidelity, but those were rare. She might mention a young teacher at her school being a bit flirtatious, but she never gave any indication that she reciprocated or let things progress further. I figured this was just my own insecurities. I'm not blind. Tracy's still attractive, and it's only natural for others to take a second glance. But that's where it ends. I made it crystal clear to Tracy from the beginning of our exclusive relationship. She responded in kind, assuring me she felt the same way. It didn't bother me if she noticed other guys, as long as it never went beyond looking. In return, I promised the same to her. That's how things were until 3 years ago. We were at our neighbor's annual summer party, 3 doors down the street in our trendy neighborhood. Scott and Wendy Harris always throw a big party at their place on the weekend after the 4th of July. Tracy and I go every year, along with most of the neighbors on our block. It's always a blast. Scott and Wendy are great hosts. There's good food and drinks, they have a big in-ground pool and a sand volleyball court. Even the people they invite from outside the neighborhood are usually nice, except for one person, but I'll get to that. The party kicks off at noon, and Tracy and I showed up around 1. I went to the bar, got a white Zinfandel for Tracy and a Michelob for myself, and we started mingling. At first, we remained together, but as conversations began to flow both inside and outside the house, we naturally drifted apart. This has never been an issue before. I would periodically check in with Tracy to see if she needed a drink refill or some snacks. Sometimes she would come find me. We would usually exchange a quick peck on the lips. I was engaged in conversation with some of the neighborhood guys, and Tracy was across the yard conversing with a group of women when a group of outsiders arrived. There was a man with 2 women, and Scott went over to welcome them. That's when I noticed the thunderbolt hitting Tracy. I happened to glance at her after looking at the newcomers, and she had stopped talking to her friends. She was watching the new group with a look on her face that I now recognize as a mix of awe and pure attraction. I didn't fully understand the look at the time, but it was clear she was captivated, and I have to admit my intuition started sending signals. She stared at them for about 10 seconds, then she turned toward me, locked eyes with me, and turned beet red before returning to her friends and rejoining the conversation. Have you ever had that odd feeling that something isn't quite right with the world, but you can't quite pinpoint what's wrong? That's the feeling I got about an hour later. I felt even more uneasy when I scanned the yard and couldn't spot Tracy. I grabbed a white wine for her at the bar and started searching. Eventually, I found her in the Harris's den chatting with 4 other people, including the guy she had been eyeing earlier. In fact, he had his arm casually around her, his hand resting on her hip. It looked a bit too cozy for my comfort, especially considering that she had apparently just met this guy. The 5 of them seemed to be having a friendly conversation. I'm pretty confident in myself and I trust my wife completely. I didn't want to make a scene, but it seemed like this guy was getting too touchy with my wife. I approached the group from behind Tracy and her new friend, grabbing his wrist firmly to remove it from her hip. I don't think we've met yet, even though you seem way too comfortable with my wife, I said in a stern tone. He tried to pull away, but I had a tight grip on his wrist, keeping him in place. Tracy, who seemed a bit flushed before I joined them, turned even redder when she saw me. "Oh, Greg, please," she sort of squealed when she realized I was holding his wrist. "Greg, this is Charles Delane. He's a European literature teacher at the college. He started last year. He's French, and he didn't do anything inappropriate, so I left his hand where it was." The others in the group were nodding in agreement, so I let go of Charles's wrist and shook his hand firmly, maybe a bit too tightly, as I felt a few bones crunch together. Tracy then introduced me to the rest of the group like an afterthought. "Thought you might need a refill," I said, handing her the wine glass while looking at Charles. "You're always so thoughtful, my dear husband," she replied. Charles, pronounced the French way as Charles, looked like typical Eurotrash to me. I have to admit he was a decent-looking guy, around 32, about 6 feet tall, and 170 pounds. He had a scruffy beard, and his hair was somewhere between long and needing a trim. He had a strong French accent in his English, and I couldn't help but think he might be sleeping with half of his students. After the introductions, he went back to talking about Victor Hugo or someone. Feeling like I'd made my point, I headed back outside to the yard. Tracy and Charles joined the sand volleyball game in the backyard. I was usually quite competitive in these matches, and we played a lot as the winner's court. Many people watched from the safety of the deck, and that's where my wife and Charles settled. I was focused on the game, so I couldn't pay too much attention to them, but I did notice plenty of touching, smiling, and even a few blushes from Tracy. Every so often, I'd wave to her, and she'd wave back. My team had been winning several games and still had control of the court an hour later when I realized that Tracy and Charles weren't in their seats anymore. I looked around the bar and grill area, but they weren't there either. My gut feeling was really strong, so I asked one of the other guys to take my place, joking that my 47-year-old legs were tired and I needed a beer badly. They teased me about being an old man as I left the sand to keep up appearances. I headed to the bar and grabbed another Michelob. I meandered around the yard for a bit and then ventured into the house. I inspected every open room and listened attentively at the closed doors, but I couldn't locate or hear Tracy or Charles. Eventually, I approached the hostess, Wendy, and casually inquired if she had seen my wife recently. She and Charles went to his car to check something, I think, Wendy said nonchalantly. What car does he drive? I asked with a hint of annoyance. That's when Wendy seemed to realize something. We'd been friends for over 15 years, and she looked concerned as she replied, it's a gray Saab. I stepped outside and glanced down the street, but there was no sign of a Saab. Wendy joined me in the driveway. I'm sure it's nothing, Greg, she said in a soothing tone. They might have just gone to the college for a moment. Thanks, probably nothing, I replied without much certainty and walked away. The local college was only a 5-minute drive from home, so I decided to check it out myself. I drove to the school and searched through all of their parking lots, but there was no sign of the Saab. I called Tracy's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail, suggesting she was either talking to someone else or her phone was off. I left a message. Over the next hour, I left her 4 more messages while sitting at home. I also reached out to her parents and sister to ask if they had heard from her. They all said no. It reminded me of a Sherlock Holmes quote, once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. I settled into my lazy boy chair in the family room and stared at the blank large screen for hours. I didn't even need to turn on the TV because the images were playing in my mind, my beautiful wife with that French guy. Seriously, why did we bother saving that country in 2 world wars? We should have just let the Germans have it. I didn't get any sleep that night. I just sat in the chair, fixating on the TV. I half expected Tracy to sneak into the house during the night, but when that didn't happen, I started to think that maybe Charles had been in a car accident with Tracy in the car. Around 8 a.m., I called the local sheriff's office, identified myself, and asked if there were any accidents during the night. They said no. I dialed Tracy's phone 4 more times and got no response each time. As noon approached, I heard a car pull into the driveway and someone got out, as indicated by the door shutting about 45 seconds later. Tracy used her key to open the door and walked in. Moments later, she entered the family room and silently settled herself on the couch across the room. If I harbored any suspicions about her recent activities, her appearance swiftly dispelled them. She had at least had the courtesy to shower before coming back. Her long blonde hair, which was loose yesterday, was now neatly tied back into a wet ponytail. She was barefaced, and her skin on her chest, shoulders, and arms had a flushed appearance. She exuded the satisfaction of someone who had thoroughly enjoyed themselves, and I must confess, she looked breathtaking. However, there was no sign of regret or guilt on her face. If anything, she seemed to wear a self-satisfied smirk. Nice to see you finally made it. Enjoyed yourself last night and this morning? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Well, actually, I did, she retorted confidently. That was not the response I had anticipated. Greg, she began in a composed tone, have you ever experienced an extraordinary physical and emotional bond with someone the moment you met them? Something electrifying, incredible, and beautiful? Yes, I have, I responded without hesitation. I married that woman. My reply shattered her calm demeanor. Her composed expression morphed into a realization of my anguish. Yesterday, I met my person like that. I can't explain it. I just need to be with him. I love him. Just like that. Are you out of your mind? I shouted. You're discarding 25 years of marriage for a feeling. Did I mean absolutely nothing to you? I'm not sure why my outburst surprised her. She started crying uncontrollably, but I was indifferent. I do love you, Greg, she finally managed to say between sobs. Our time together has been wonderful. But this connection I feel now is unlike anything I've ever experienced. I love you, but I'm in love with him. It's incredible. Incredible, huh? Well, take some time to appreciate that, and then maybe we can throw a party, I retorted sarcastically. So, are you planning to file for divorce, or should I? Either way, it'll be a 50-50 split, and we can sell the house and divide the proceeds. I was the one growing frustrated now. What? I protested. That's not how this works. You don't get to keep me as a safety net. If you're with him, then go be with him as soon as you want. As far as I'm concerned, we were over when you first got together with him yesterday. Your continued involvement with him only solidifies my decision. But... She stuttered. All right then. I'll handle the divorce proceedings, and I'll be out of here by the end of the week. As promised, I moved my belongings out of our house by the end of the week, taking a few days off work to facilitate the process. One evening, while I was loading my pickup truck, Scott and Wendy Harris approached, expressing their regret for inviting Charles to their party. I reassured them, explaining that they couldn't have foreseen Tracy's reaction. Still, we feel responsible, Wendy admitted, her gaze lowered. My attorney prepared the divorce papers, and Tracy was served within a month. It seemed she had expected me to procrastinate, so my lawyer informed me that the process server reported her fury upon receiving the papers. This likely explains why she showed up at my new apartment 2 days later, ringing the doorbell and storming in when I answered. "How could you do this if you love me?" she yelled as she entered my apartment. Initially, I was taken aback, but my surprise quickly turned into anger. "Are you seriously not understanding this?" I retorted. "You're with another man. What did you expect me to do? Maybe I love you, and if things don't work out with him, what am I supposed to do then? Just wait for you to come back. Give me some time. If this doesn't pan out, I'll come back to you and be the perfect wife. We can still have a future together." "You're not seeing reality," I countered. "I'm not giving you the green light to have your affair and then return if it doesn't work out. And if he's truly your dream guy, why wouldn't it work out?" "Charles is in the process of divorcing his wife, and they're sorting out financial matters," she began. "In other words, he might be Mr. Right for you, but the feeling might not be mutual." I questioned. More stumbling over her words followed before I finally told her to leave my apartment if she wanted to continue her affair, or I'd kick her out. Tracy and her lawyer did everything they could to delay the divorce proceedings. Meanwhile, Mr. Wonderful moved into my former house, effectively taking my place. Update: 4 months later, I was leaving Chez Michel's with a colleague after a business dinner when I saw 2 familiar faces approaching the door. It was Charles and a visibly pregnant Tracy, who seemed to be about 3 months along. I stopped in my tracks, staring and blocking their way into the restaurant. "Oh my God," I muttered quietly. My colleague also stopped, looking quite puzzled as the 4 of us stood face to face. "Serge, meet my wife for a little while longer and her boyfriend, Charles Delane," I introduced with a hint of sarcasm. Serge had the awkward task of remaining polite in this uncomfortable situation. I thought he handled it as well as possible. She's pregnant." "Is it yours?" he stammered. "That's definitely his," I replied cheerfully. "You're such a jerk, Greg. You know that?" she retorted as she and Charles passed us and entered the restaurant. Later, Wendy Harris informed me that Tracy was indeed 3 months pregnant. It turned out Charles was such a wonderful guy that Tracy wanted to have his child and went off birth control. "I wish you the best," I told Wendy. The divorce was finalized a few months later, and 2 months after that, Tracy gave birth to a boy. Naturally, they named him Charles Jr., because when you're that remarkable, what better way to express it than by naming another person after yourself? Our daughter, Morgan, wasn't exactly thrilled with Tracy's decision to have another child at this stage of her life, especially since her parents were no longer together and I wasn't the father. I must admit, I felt a sense of pride in Morgan for siding with me in this complicated situation. Although I knew she had the baby, I hadn't spoken to Tracy or seen her since our encounter at the restaurant many months ago. I knew a meeting was inevitable, given that we both lived in the same town. However, I must confess, I was quite taken aback the first time I saw Tracy after she had given birth. The extra weight didn't flatter her, and it seemed the whole experience had taken a toll on her 49-year-old body. I almost walked right past the woman who looked like a grandmother pushing a stroller with a 1-year-old boy inside at the local mall. "Come on, Greg, there's no need to be rude," a voice I recognized all too well said as I hurried past them on a Saturday afternoon. I abruptly stopped and, despite my attempt not to, I did a slow double-take at the woman and the baby. Oh no, this was Tracy and her son. "Hey there, stranger," I managed to say as I gathered my thoughts. "Hey yourself," she replied. The baby was undeniably cute. He had Tracy's hair and eye color but bore his father's slightly darker complexion. "Wow, Mom, he's adorable," I genuinely remarked. Tracy blushed slightly and graciously thanked me. "I haven't seen you in a while, and well, pushing a stroller," I added, attempting to apologize for not recognizing her immediately. Although she visibly flinched at my apology, she chose to let it slide without comment. While I found her incredibly attractive after Morgan's birth many years ago, she was over 20 years older now, and since this baby wasn't mine, I suppose my hormones were quite under control. We chatted pleasantly for a few more minutes, mostly about her lack of sleep, and I sensed a genuine note of sadness, something she had never shown after Morgan's birth. I eventually excused myself, offering apologies, and went on with my shopping, which had been my original intent. I saw Tracy again at the Harris's summer party about 6 months later. Scott and Wendy always felt bad that Tracy met Charles at their party, but I assured them that I didn't blame them for her bad choices. Still, Wendy kept trying to set me up with her single and divorced friends, and I have to admit, some of those setups were pretty decent. They kept inviting me to their annual summer party, and even though I had skipped the last two, I decided to go this time, even though they warned me that Tracy and Charles would be there too. I assured them that if any issues arose, I wouldn't be the one causing them, and I meant it. I was at the party for a couple of hours when I noticed Tracy and Charles entering the backyard. Since the baby wasn't with them, I assumed they had left the baby with a babysitter. Tracy had shed some of her pregnancy weight and didn't look as much like a grandmother as she did the last time I saw her. Still, I couldn't ignore the sadness in her once bright blue eyes. Even when she smiled, there was something missing in her gaze. I addressed the elephant in the room early on by approaching Tracy and Charles, giving her a light hug and shaking his hand. I think both of them were a bit surprised, and I could swear I saw Wendy holding her breath as I walked over to them. We chatted briefly for maybe a minute, then I excused myself and returned to my group of friends by the grill. When the sand volleyball game started, I joined one of the teams. We played the second game, and while I was on the court, I noticed Tracy sitting in a chair, watching and cheering. I didn't see Mr. Wonderful anywhere around. After 2 rounds, we lost the second one, so we had to vacate the court and wait for our next opportunity. As I was getting a beer, I noticed Tracy sitting by herself. Some things never change, I mused to myself. I grabbed my drink and headed inside. The third room I checked turned out to be the den, and sure enough, my instincts were spot on. Charles had his arm around Marilyn Jansen's waist while engaged in a small group conversation, and Marilyn was gazing at him with clear desire in her eyes. Marilyn used to be my neighbor, and she was undoubtedly married. I thought to myself that I should have just kept to myself. If this is what I suspect, he's going to hook up with this woman tonight and cheat on Tracy. If I don't say anything, I'm in the wrong. If I do tell her, there's going to be trouble, and I'll still be in the wrong. A true friend would talk to her, but I wasn't a true friend, I was her ex-husband. Why should I even be responsible for this? But then fate intervened and made the decision for me. Marilyn's husband, Troy, was on my sand volleyball team and apparently followed me inside to discuss some strategy. He saw the same thing I did. Charles with his arm around his wife and her looking at Charles like he's the best thing since sliced bread. "You jerk, get your hands off my wife," he yelled at Charles as he lunged towards them. I started to step in to prevent a fight, but then common sense prevailed, and I let my volleyball teammate rush past me. Before Charles could pull away from Troy's wife, Troy had grabbed Charles's arm. They returned about 10 minutes later with 2 police officers. The cops took statements from everyone present in the room at the time, just in case Charles wanted to press charges against Troy Jansen. The older officer, Sergeant Jim Hill, seemed to be around my age. The younger officer was Officer Kathleen McDonald, who appeared to be in her 40s and every bit as Irish as her name suggested, with her freckles, green eyes, and long red hair. I made sure to go over to Officer McDonald's side so I could give my statement to her. Amidst this commotion, Tracy was in tears. Officer McDonald noticed Tracy waiting for me and questioned me next. I explained what I saw and added that Charles had stolen my wife at this very party 3 years ago. She seemed surprised by my remark. "And you're still going to take her to the hospital for him?" she asked. "Are you that nice or just a complete idiot?" I gotta admit, that caught me off guard. I looked at her face and saw her trying not to smile. "Definitely a complete idiot," I replied. She didn't see that response coming either and let out a small laugh. I kind of liked that sound. After answering a couple more questions, I was done giving my statement. She said I could take Tracy to the hospital, but before I left, she warned me that Tracy might not believe my story if I told her. "Don't count on her believing me," I replied as I began to turn away. She started to move on to the next person for a statement, but a quick thought popped into my head and then out of my mouth. "Maybe you should give me your card in case I remember something else, officer." She grinned back at me, her eyes practically lighting up. She took a card from her uniform shirt's top left pocket, flipped it over, and jotted down what seemed to be her personal phone number. "Thanks, officer," I chuckled at her, then put on a determined expression and turned to Tracy. "Let's go." On the way to the hospital, Tracy asked me what happened to Charles. I told her the truth, fully expecting her not to believe me. "Can't you just move on, Greg?" she complained. "It's been 3 years now." "It's not about moving on, Tracy," I replied. Charles shouldn't have been getting handsy with Marilyn Jansen, and Troy was right to step in. Maybe if I'd been that assertive, you and I might still be together. Neither of us expected those words to come out of my mouth. Tracy's eyes welled up with tears before she turned her head away from me in the pickup. I left Tracy at the emergency room and didn't accompany her inside. She would need to arrange a ride back to the modest home she shared with Charles, as we had sold our house and divided the money after the divorce. With her out of sight for the evening, I reached into my shirt pocket for the card Officer Kathleen MacDonald had given me earlier. A delightful woman, I thought to myself. Trying to play it cool, I waited 3 days before dialing Officer Kathleen MacDonald. She answered on the second ring. Could you have taken any longer? I could be engaged and married by now, she teased over the phone. Guess you're right, but if you're that quick, you might miss out on becoming the next and last Mrs. Alan Gregerson, I shot back. Now who's getting cheeky, she retorted. How do you know I'll even agree when you ask me out? And no, I don't want to go to some Irish pub for a date. Her comment about the Irish pub caught me off guard because, honestly, that's what I had in mind. It seemed like a fitting idea to take an Irish girl to an Irish pub. She sensed my hesitation and nailed it. What's the deal with you guys? Can any of you think outside the box? You see red hair and you automatically think Irish pub. I stumbled for a moment before coming up with my plan B. Our city had an amazing Greek restaurant that I loved, and Greek cuisine was a far cry from Irish. She responded positively in a split second. Thanks for switching things up a bit, she said. Once I reject the Irish pub, most guys default to Asian. Sorry, but I'm not into food that could pass for a cockroach haven. I burst out laughing at that, and I think that's when I realized I might have found someone to spend my life with. We talked for another hour, covering a wide range of topics. I found out she was actually 45 and had been divorced for a decade. Her ex also had fidelity issues. She had a son who was a sophomore at Michigan State studying pre-law. Our Saturday night dinner was incredible, and the company was even better. I picked her up at her house on the south side of town and was taken aback by how stunning my lovely girl looked in her little black dress and 4-inch heels. All the right curves, great legs, a pretty face, and that vibrant red hair. She was the living definition of gorgeous. We had one of those conversations that meandered through all kinds of subjects. I could have listened to her voice all night. She didn't seem eager to rush into marriage, just like I wasn't in a hurry to tie the knot. This made her both relaxed and intriguing, as her naturally inquisitive nature shone through like that of a cop. She asked thought-provoking questions, showing she was thinking as she listened to my answers. I drove her back home after dinner. I didn't invite her inside my place, and she didn't extend an invitation either. We exchanged good nights on her doorstep, and then she leaned in for a gentle kiss on my cheek. I'm pretty sure I turned 3 shades of red, wished her good night, and floated back to my car. The drive home is a blur in my memory. Gosh, I felt like a teenager again. Her lips on my cheek were soft, and I'm quite certain she was wearing White Shoulders perfume. She called me up on Sunday morning, asking if I wanted to join her for bagels and lox at her place. How could I possibly turn down that invitation? Wendy and Scott invited me over for dinner a few days later, partly to apologize for everything that happened and also to get my side of the story. It turns out Charles was threatening to sue them as well as Troy Jansen. This guy must think he's a real catch, Scott blurted out at one point. He's quite good-looking, dear, and quite charming, I have to admit that, Wendy said before Scott shot her a glare that could melt steel. Troy spent the whole weekend in jail before getting bailed out on Monday morning, according to what the Harrisas said. When he got back home, Marilyn and their 2 kids were nowhere to be found. They had gone to stay with her mother in another town. Scott mentioned that their 12-year marriage was likely over. Well, pass along my number to Troy and let him know that I, more than anyone, understand what he's dealing with. I'll be there if he wants someone to talk to, and I've got his back when this goes to court. We'll let him know, and I'm sure he'll appreciate that, Scott Harris said. By the way, this was our last summer fling. I can't handle this kind of drama. As Scott spoke, Wendy's gaze was fixed on her plate of peas. I got the sense that things weren't going so well in Harrisland since the party. Update: a few months later, when 47-year-old Wendy started showing a baby bump in public, my suspicions were confirmed. I didn't need to guess who the likely father was because Scott himself called me to spill the beans. Can you believe this? He practically shouted into the phone when I answered. That jerk got my wife pregnant. She's been having an affair with that guy since last year's party. Scott told me he had no clue until Wendy started getting sick every other morning, just like she did when she was pregnant with their 2 kids years ago. When Scott confronted her about it, she confessed that she and Charles had been having an affair for over a year. Though most of the time they used protection, they ran out of it during a long weekend when they both managed to sneak away from home and stay at a motel. They thought a few times without protection wouldn't hurt. Then Scott asked me for the name of my attorney. Can I at least get a friends and family discount? He joked in a dry tone. Charles and Wendy had apparently moved into an apartment near the campus, leaving Tracy and her son on their own, according to Scott. I responded, not considering the viewpoint of a woman. As I was dining at a local fast food joint, she approached my table, her son in tow. She placed her meal across from me, and the young boy quickly took the seat next to me. Hello, Tracy. Hello, CJ, I greeted them. The little boy, about 3 years old, offered a clean hand for a handshake. I was taken aback by his attempt at maturity, so I firmly shook his small hand. Good day, sir, he said in his most solemn voice. Hi, Greg, Tracy added. He's growing up quickly, I observed, looking at her son. You might have a tall one in the future. I could see from Tracy's face that she appreciated my effort to be friendly. But something was troubling her, and it was evident. If she didn't bring it up soon, she might explode. Feel free to ask me anything, I gently encouraged her, watching her son unwrap a cheeseburger. Did you ever truly love me as you professed? She started softly. Because if you did, why didn't you fight for me like Troy did for Marilyn? Why didn't you ask me to come back like someone who genuinely loved me would have? Why haven't you visited my house to check on us or even invited us over for an evening? I wasn't expecting that at all. Suddenly, this was being put on me. I took a deep breath and shook my head. I wanted to stay composed and avoid an angry confrontation. So, this is all my fault. I exhaled slowly. Seriously, I'm the one who did wrong here, and you're the innocent party? My voice started to rise as I spoke. This wasn't what I intended. I needed to make my point. If you remember, I removed Charles's hand from your waist, but you insisted that nothing was happening and I shouldn't cause any trouble. I trusted you completely and believed your word, so I didn't push further. Excuse me for having so much trust in you. If I had known then what I know now, I wouldn't have trusted you. I would have confronted him like Troy did. But you, the person I trusted the most in the world, lied to me, so I didn't fight for you. Then, when you came home the next day around noon, what could I do? The damage was already done. It was quite obvious. So, what was there to fight about at that point? You had given yourself to another man and broken our vows. There was nothing left for me to fight for. You made it very clear. You made it crystal clear. This was your decision alone, and I had no say in it. So, what was there to fight about? You were no longer mine, you were his. But you didn't even try to change my mind, she complained, or make an effort to make me stay. Nothing. If you truly loved me, how many times did you sleep with Charles that first night and in the morning? I bet it was multiple times, I stated. Once was a huge mistake, maybe forgivable. Twice was a deliberate choice, and more than that was you shattering my heart into pieces. And you had the audacity to tell me you had a fantastic time, an incredible connection, if I recall correctly. And that you and he had this almost magical bond. You didn't show any remorse. Lust and salt share the same letters. So, what were my options? As the saying goes, if you love something, let it go. If it comes back, it's yours. If not, it never was. I continued, and then just to add insult to injury, you have his child at 48. I couldn't even convince you to have a second child in 25 years, but not only did you readily embrace Mr. Wonderful, but you let him impregnate you. So, this is all about your wounded male pride, she responded, a bit snippier than I'd prefer. I reacted quickly, but with her child at the table, I held back from taking the bait. No, what you chose to do once you were with him was your decision. You loved him enough to have his baby, even though you refused that with me. I got the message loud and clear. We ate quietly for a few minutes. She seemed unsure. I knew where the conversation was headed, but someone had to bring it up. So, what's your plan now? I finally inquired. You and Charles never got married, but he's acknowledged as the child's father, right? At the very least, you should pursue child support from him. I'll let Wendy deal with him, Tracy replied, but you're right. I should demand child support from that cheater. That's good advice. Do you ever wonder about it sometimes? She added. What might have been? Honestly, no, I replied in a hushed tone. You shattered my heart so completely that I never wanted to imagine what could have been. There are some wonderful memories from our past that I'll always cherish. But that chapter is closed, and there's no going back. As we continued our meal, I watched the young boy toy with his fries. It brought back memories of our daughter, Morgan, at that age. He's a good kid, I commented. It's nice to see something positive came from that relationship. Despite the initial intense connection, we never truly bonded the way you and I did. Our early days were filled with passion, but we never evolved as a couple. Love couldn't fill the void left when the initial desire faded. It seemed to hit her then, a sort of revelation. She shook her head, a hint of sadness in her eyes, tears welling up. She had traded the comfort and security of love for the transient spark of lust. Like lightning, it had its brilliant moment before vanishing. My beloved and I recently celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary with a trip to an unexpected destination, Spain. I playfully suggested a visit to her homeland, but after a playful jab, she chose a warmer and spicier location. Our relationship can be described in the same way, warmer and spicier. We have a few more years of work left before retiring from the cybersecurity firm we co-founded. Since my transition from engineering and her departure from the police force to start the company, things have gone remarkably well. We're nearly inseparable, both in business and in our personal lives, yet the magic hasn't faded. It might sound cliché, but I think I fall for her a bit more each day. Between the two of us, we now have 5 grandchildren. Despite one branch of the family residing in Denver, Colorado, and the other in Houston, Texas, we manage to see them regularly. I occasionally run into Tracy around town, but our conversations rarely go beyond a few sentences. She's busy being a mom to CJ, who's around 13 now. To my knowledge, she hasn't remarried and rarely dates. My daughter, who occasionally talks to her, shares this. It appears Mr. Wonderful had to be persuaded into paying child support consistently, even facing legal intervention. Her life seems somewhat bleak, lacking many luxuries. But everyone makes their choices and has to live with the consequences. I won't apologize for moving on with my life.
Don't forget to subscribe, like, and click on the little bell icon for notifications of new stories.